Cultural bias. Cultural bias is the tendency to judge all people or things in terms of your own cultural assumptions. Cultural differences are exaggerated and are seen as abnormal or inferior. In psychology, this is shown through doing research or theorizing through one culture and applying it to all others. Ethnocentrism is a form of cultural bias, and it believes in superiority within one group. It suggests that behaviours that don't conform are unsophisticated or underdeveloped. And an example of this is in the strange situation done by Ainsworth, where the study was done only in America, and then generalised and applied to other cultures, leading to an unfair representation of them, as Ainsworth hadn't taken into account the fact that other cultures might parent differently. Cultural relativism is the idea that norms, values, ethics, and moral standards can't be meaningful or understood unless within specific social and cultural contexts. This is saying that you need to take everything about one culture into account before generalising or making any assumptions. This was looked into by Sternberg in 1985, who looked at the fact that different skills that are essential to life change within each culture, so even levels of intelligence need to take cultural context into account. John Berry studied cultural relativism through his research of etic and emic approaches. An etic approach looks at a behaviour from outside of a given culture and attempts to describe those behaviours that are universal. An emic approach functions from within or inside certain cultures and identifies behaviours that are specific to that culture. Ainsworth's research is an example of an imposed etic. She studied behaviour within one single culture, which was America, and assumed that her ideal attachment type could be applied universally. John Berry states that psychology is guilty of imposing an etic approach. Theories, models, and concepts that are universal come through emic research within a single culture. He suggests that psychologists should be much more mindful of the cultural relativism of their research. Evaluation. Individualism and collectivism. It's said that there are two types of cultures, an individualist culture and a collectivist culture. An individualist culture, which is usually associated with Western countries, are thought to value personal freedom and independence. Examples of this are Britain and America. Collectivist cultures, such as India and China, are thought to value more interdependence and needs of a group. In the past, psychologists have referenced cultures in these ways. However, a 1999 study found that there's no traditional distinction between these cultures. This suggests that cultural bias in research is less of an issue. Cultural relativism versus universality. Berry's concept of an imposed etic reminds us to be culturally specific. However, all psychology should not be culturally relative. For example, Ekman suggests that things like facial expressions are universal. This means that a full understanding of human behaviour requires the study of both universal and variation among individuals and groups. Unfamiliarity with research tradition. When conducting research, participants' familiarity with aims and objectives are assumed. Due to this, demand characteristics may be exaggerated when working with other cultures. This may have an adverse effect on validity of research. Operationalization of variables. Another issue with conducting research in different cultures is that variables may not be experienced in the same way by all participants. For example, facial expressions may be viewed differently. Issues like this could affect interactions between the researcher and participants or between different participants. Any other examples of possible variables are things like gender, where sex roles stereotypes may vary, aggression, and relationships. This is an issue because operationalization of variables needs to be the same or the validity may be questioned. So if an experiment is designed for only one culture, there may be biased results. Challenging implicit assumptions. One of the great things of cross-cultural research is that it challenges our typical Western ways, and it might promote cultural relativism and stop scientific racism. Experienced cross-cultural researchers recommend the inclusion of at least one member of a local population. This is to educate researchers of cultural practices, provide a sense of reassurance, and it also helps with cultural bias and language barriers. So now to look over the apply it's and the check it's of the textbook. Firstly, explain why culturally biased intelligence tests may lead to racial stereotyping and discrimination of particular groups in society. I said that this is because different cultures label intelligence differently, leading the people of it to act differently, leading to different groups to be labelled less intelligent. These different groups being labelled as less intelligent could lead to racial stereotyping and discrimination of particular groups in society. Why do you think CBS list was removed? This is to be more universal. So as I said, CBS stands for Culture Bound Syndrome. In some parts of the world and in some cultures, certain mental disorders are seen more often than others. For example, eating disorders such as anorexia should be considered CBSs as they are much more prevalent in the Western world and virtually absent in many other cultures. These CBSs made the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and the International Classification of Diseases ethnocentric. Discuss some of the potential methodological issues of replicating the ASH study with the Macho Piro tribe of Peru, which is a community that had very limited contact with the wider world. The issue with this is that the participants will need to speak English or have a form of translator, meaning some things could get lost in translation. As this tribe have little contact with the world, they may have unfamiliarity with research tradition, so they may not be as responsive or confident. This might affect the validity due to Professor EMIC standards, and also it's hard to replicate studies in other cultures. Now to just look over some of the check-its. So there are 3 questions. The first one, outline what it is meant by cultural bias in psychology for 3 marks. So what I just said was, cultural bias is judging someone based on your own cultural assumptions. In psychology, this is shown through doing research or theorizing through your own culture and applying it to all. An example of this is Ash's line study when he only studied American males and applied his findings to all other cultures. The second one for 4 marks is describe one example of ethnocentrism in psychology. So I said ethnocentrism is the judgment of other cultures by the standards and values of one's own culture. An example of this is Ainsworth's Strange Situation in 1970, as it only reflected the norms and values of American culture, meaning different parenting styles in other cultures were looked down upon and viewed badly. For the last one, which is the main essay question for 16 marks, discuss cultural bias in psychology, refer to examples of research in your own answer. I split it into half AO1, half AO3, and I had 6 paragraphs in total. What I personally did was I firstly defined cultural bias. Second paragraph, I defined ethnocentrism and gave an example, which was the Strange Situation. Then I defined cultural relativism and gave an example and discussed ETIC, EMIC approaches and John Berry, which was all AO1. So for the AO3, I discussed individualist and collectivist cultures, then cultural relativism versus universality, and unfamiliarity with tradition. Thank you, and I hope this helped.